Hi, FamTech founders. This is Lauren, our entrepreneur in residence, and I am fielding office hours questions from you all from week 2. There's one question that came in from Crystal, founder of Inner Hive, which is what's best practice for how long you should allow learning before making a pivot? It is likely subjective as it's centered around slower momentum and or metrics that aren't signaling growth at a desired rate, but I'm trying to get a sense of general time frame. This is a really good question, Crystal. I think a lot of us struggle with this because we want to believe that our product, what we have in mind, our idea is something that folks want, and it could be. So to answer your question briefly, you're right that it's subjective, but I'd say you really don't need that many data points to know if something isn't resonating with a buyer. In the context of user interviews, for example, which was our session from week 2, or if you're getting early sales feedback, the rule of 3 is a pretty good rule of thumb. What this means is if you've talked to 3 users of the same demographic, let's say, for instance, your users are parents who have tech jobs in coastal cities with income between 150 and 200K, and you haven't gotten any signal of interest in what you're offering, that's enough to expand your lens. I wouldn't necessarily say pivot, but to expand your lens to either a different audience. So, for instance, interview parents who have, let's say, gig economy jobs with income between 50 and 100K, or B, a different offering. So maybe the pain point that you thought you were solving for actually isn't that big of an issue. So what pain points did you actually discover in your interview with these parents that they'd actually pay for? And the really, really key thing here is to ask the right questions to get the right signal. A lot of times, the mistake people make is asking what I call leading questions. And oftentimes it's easy to ask these leading questions because users you interview want to be encouraging versus crush your idea, right? So if you ask questions like, would you use a leave planning tool? They're likely to say something like, yeah, sure, I would, giving you potentially false signal. Instead, you really want to ask questions that are quite concrete and focus on past behaviors. Like, for example, when was the last time you went on leave and what challenges did you run into? So, again, it's objective, right? What happened in the past? Like, what did you actually do? It helps really just draw the conversation to stories, helps you learn about the problem, how it's being tackled currently, and gives you insight into whether your solution that you have in mind or that you're proposing actually solves anything. And I highly, highly recommend reading a book called The Mom Test if you want to learn more about asking good user research interview questions that actually give you the right signal here. Hey, FamTech founders, it's Lauren coming to you from week 3 office hours. We got a question from Debbie that I'm going to read out to you around pricing. For those niche but high impact benefits, what B2B pricing strategy have you found drives the most adoption? It seems most companies are moving away from PEPM for niche benefits. Can you address the pros and cons of subscription, usage-based, or other models and general ranges that seem acceptable? Debbie, this is such a good question. A lot of founders just don't realize pricing is a part of your product. And just like you have to find product market fit, you also have to find pricing market fit in as part of that. You're also spot on that a lot of buyers have moved away from the PEPM model. And the reason for that is that it's hard to justify paying for all your employees if only, let's say, like a single digit percent of them are going to use a certain benefit. So let's say fertility benefit may only be used by a small percent of your population. That said, the pro of having a PEPM model is that you get predictable revenue that's recurring because it's subscription. The con, though, as you kind of astutely pointed out, is that it can be harder to sell or get adoption from a buyer organization because a lot of times they, as I mentioned, don't want to justify it or have trouble justifying it. Or also they're just concerned because they don't have pre-existing data on how many people or what percent of their population is actually going to utilize that benefit. So with Cocoon, for example, when we were selling into these high growth tech companies like Acarta or Benchling in the early days, a lot of times they hadn't had many leaves before because their population had only just started to mature to the point where there were enough parents that were starting to go on leave, as an example, right? And they hadn't had too many folks take medical leave, so it's just hard to predict. I have two suggestions from my experience building Cocoon as far as what strategy can drive the most adoption. Um, the first one is I recommend experimenting with some hybrid models. So you could include like a PEPM subscription component and also a usage-based component. So at Cocoon, we had a version of pricing where you would pay a small PEPM and also a per leave or per usage fee. Now, my second tip is actually really just to talk to the actual buyer themselves. So again, fold this into your user interview conversation, right? And get a sense of what buyers pay for other benefits. And also just ask them directly, like what price is so expensive you wouldn't even consider it? And then what price is high, but you would think about it, right? And to check out those survey questions, I'll drop the link in the chat. Check out the Van Westendorp pricing survey. And then finally, in terms of pricing ranges, what I've seen typically is that pure benefits, like let's say like a mental health benefit, pretty much rarely exceed, call it like the low single digit PEPM, so maybe $2 PEPM. If you're going to charge a much higher PEPM, like $6, $7, for example, typically what I've seen is that that needs to be justified by some other value prop besides being an employee benefit. So, for example, you need to be saving HR teams time or cost on legal things, for example. So there needs to be some sort of like administrative burden relief that you're doing for the HR team, or you're saving them on headcount, for instance. Okay, that's it for now, but looking forward to more questions around pricing in particular, since I know this is something that a lot of folks are in the phase of testing and experimenting with. All right, talk soon. Hi, FamTech founders. It's Lauren, your entrepreneur in residence, coming to you right before daycare pickup for another office hours session. So last week we talked about selling into HR and got a really good question from Debbie in terms of what happens once you've exhausted your personal network as far as getting to your first kind of couple customers. What sales outreach methods have you found to be truly responsive after your first few logos, but before you've had more momentum? So examples like webinars, cold email outreach, LinkedIn groups, conferences, PR, etc. There are so many ways to spend money and time. So true, Debbie. And a lot of these things are not going to be a good use of your time or money. So let's break this down into what I personally found very useful from my experience building Cocoon. First of all, word of mouth is super, super critical in your early days, and making your early customers extreme super fans of you, like going the extra mile to really make sure that they're happy is key, because they're the ones who are going to refer you to other customers in their network and also brokers. So a good example of this is Adam, who was our first customer at Carta. He referred us to the brokerage Marsh McLennan agency MMA, which became a big partner of ours over time. Another example of this is Vivek, who you all heard from at Benchling. He referred us to a number of other people leaders at other really similar kind of like high growth startups that had similar needs to them. So again, just cannot emphasize enough how important it is to make sure your early customers are happy and have strong NPS or Net Promoter Score, meaning that they'll share about you to their friends. Okay, number two, I actually think that in the early days, things like small group dinners can be really, really impactful. So something that we leveraged a lot at Cocoon, where, for example, you get together a group of maybe 10 or so HR leaders, and perhaps one to two of them would be existing customers of yours. And there'd be a theme around, for example, what is the future of leave going to look like at your company, right? Policy wise, like what's going well, what's not going well, having these discussion questions, and it not being sales oriented at all, but purely just a conversation that's value add to those around the table, as far as genuinely like, what can I learn from this other people leader, and how do we make connections there? People really, really value that. and will naturally kind of come through the funnel as a result and feel affinity for you as a result of that. And a lot of times these dinners can be relatively, you could say, kind of like targeted in the sense that your early adopters anyway going to be a pretty specific sort of like profile. And so it helps you keep it very targeted, especially around budget. All right, third thing is webinars. So I do think doing webinars can be effective in the early days after you've had a first couple of customers. However, what I'd really say with any events like dinners or webinars especially, anything that you need more audience for is I highly encourage cross-pollination with other players in the ecosystem who can bring your target audience to you. So it could be partnering with another startup who's selling into the same buyer, like HR titles. It could be partnering with a broker, for example, that you know and like. So I'll give you an example. In the early days, we did a webinar that was kind of like a very casual conversation over Zoom with two wonderful brokers over at Sequoia. And it was, they brought a lot of their clients who were interested in leave and hearing from us about that. We talked a lot about sort of like the future trends around leave and so forth, and like how COVID was changing it, the landscape, and what folks need to know. That actually brought us a number of different customers like Vanta and so forth that became early Cocoon customers. So similar to how you might sort of like see influencers cross-pollinate on YouTube, on Instagram, TikTok, etc., like the same idea works here. And then finally on conferences, I would just be very targeted. Do not spend a ton of your time going to conferences because they often can be very broad and not your segment. So I'd find in conferences that are very specific to your early adopter. So for us, one particular conference that was useful after we had maybe like 50 plus customers was Transform. And Transform is basically a conference that's really targeted towards tech startups and HR leaders at tech startups or growth companies. That's very different than, say, going to like conference board where it's like very enterprise type companies. So be very specific about the conferences that you attend because they can be expensive. Frankly, they're just a lot of time to plan, be there, and have a presence, especially if you're going to have a booth or anything like that. So that's it for now, but great question and excited for more to come.